Melania Trump entered expecting soft questions, but Jasmine Crockett brought fire. In 17 minutes, illusions shattered into a battle over race power and who's qualified. One email, one sentence. 36 seconds of silence. Two women, one set, and a truth that could burn reputations nationwide. When the smoke clears, who will still be standing? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The lights in the Fox News studio dimmed to a cinematic glow, casting a sharp silhouette of the stage where two women sat under the banner, Women in American Power. The cameras zoomed in slowly, the live broadcast just seconds away. The audience, made up of donors, pundits, and high-profile political aides, buzzed with anticipation. Then she stepped out, Melania Trump, cloaked in a pristine white dress that shimmered under the studio lights like armor masquerading as grace. Her hair perfectly sculpted, her eyes cold and calculating. She moved like someone who never had to earn a microphone. She greeted the audience with a polished smile, took her seat, crossed her legs like a runway model, not a policymaker, and tilted the balance of the room before saying a word. The host introduced the topic of the night: what makes a woman qualified to lead in modern America? And with that, Melania leaned forward, her voice wrapped in silk but laced with steel. She smiled gently, glanced sideways at Jasmine, then turned to the camera and delivered the first cut with surgical precision. America needs women who understand their place, graceful, disciplined, thoughtful. Not loud, not reckless, and certainly not unqualified. The word unqualified hung in the air like the snap of a whip. A soft wave of laughter broke through the audience, subtle but vicious, the kind that didn't need volume to land like a punch. Jasmine Crockett sat still, her back straight, hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on Melania, not with anger but calculation. She didn't blink, not once. The camera caught it, that quiet fire behind her gaze like a storm biding its time. The tension in the room didn't fade. It deepened, thickened like the air before a thunderstorm that everyone feels but no one names. Melania's jab had landed, and she knew it. The audience's laughter had been her signal to press forward, to twist the knife she'd already slid in. Jasmine hadn't responded, not yet, but her silence had weight, and that weight was growing heavier by the second. The host shifted in his chair, sensing the unease settle over the studio like dust. The lights stayed hot, the camera stayed close, and Melania, mistaking Jasmine's stillness for retreat, made her next move. This time she aimed not at reputation but at temperament. She folded her hands tighter, sat up straighter, and said with syrupy calm, "I have no problem with diversity, but I do have a problem with lack of standards and emotional outbursts." She spoke slowly, savoring every syllable, like it had been rehearsed in a gold-plated mirror. Then came the pointed jab, thinly veiled as observation. We've all seen it: shouting in hearings, dramatic gestures. It's more about reactions than reason, more performance than policy. Her voice didn't rise, but her words slapped like open palms. Everyone knew who she meant. It was Jasmine Crockett she was carving out of that sentence, carving her down to a caricature, loud, angry, erratic. The implication was clear. Diversity was fine, so long as it stayed quiet and knew its place. Jasmine didn't twitch. She didn't roll her eyes or scoff or fidget. She just exhaled once through her nose like a boxer measuring distance before a punch. Then, calm as a slow-turning tide, she spoke low, even unshaken. "So let me ask," she said, eyes still locked on Melania, voice like held steel, "is your definition of qualified a woman who stays silent at dinner while unjust laws get signed in the other room?" The words hit like a sudden drop in pressure. The audience froze. Even the cameras paused, as if uncertain where to cut. Jasmine had moved the conversation from image to integrity, from style to substance, and in just one line she had drawn a line in the sand. The silence that followed Jasmine's question wasn't just awkward, it was surgical. It sliced through the room like a scalpel through soft tissue, exposing something raw underneath the quiet shame of complicity. Melania didn't move. Her chin remained high, but her eyes flickered just for a second, as if she hadn't expected the punch to land so clean. The audience had gone completely still. There was no laughter now, no polite applause. The camera zoomed in instinctively, sensing something pivotal unfolding. Jasmine didn't press the moment with theatrics. She reached beside her chair with calm purpose and pulled out a matte black folder, thin but heavy with substance. No logo, no pretense, just facts. She placed it across her lap, opened it with care, and held up a color-coded chart like it was a blade she'd been waiting to unsheath. Since arriving in Congress, I've co-authored and passed 42 federal bills, bipartisan, community-focused, and rooted in justice. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Each word struck with the weight of earned authority. The chart glowed under the lights, highlighting legislation on healthcare equity, criminal justice reform, voting protections, each marked with dates, votes, and signatures. There was no ego in her tone, just receipts, cold, hard public service. She looked at the audience, then at the moderator, and finally deliberately turned to Melania. Her voice sharpened, not with anger, but with precise control. "And you, Mrs. Trump." She let the words hang long enough for the cameras to center on Melania's perfectly blank expression. "How many policy meetings did you attend during your 4 years in the White House?" It wasn't a question. It was a countdown. She didn't give time for a reply. Jasmine tilted her head slightly as if remembering something trivial but telling. "Because from what I remember," she said, "your biggest contribution was picking out the drapes in the East Wing." That line detonated silently like a bomb wrapped in silk. The audience didn't gasp. They didn't laugh. They froze. Even the studio's LED backdrop seemed to dim under the weight of what had just been said. From the control room came a string of clipped, panicked instructions. But on stage, no one moved. No one dared. Jasmine sat back slowly, eyes forward, composed, while Melania Trump sat exposed not by insult, but by comparison. And in a room built for images, it was the absence of response that spoke the loudest. The air was tense, stretched thin by Jasmine's last strike. Melania's eyes didn't flicker, but something in her jaw tightened, a flash of calculation behind the cool facade. She had been cornered and she felt it. The studio lights burned hotter now, not because of temperature, but because of truth. She adjusted slightly in her chair, smoothing the fabric of her dress with fingers that moved just a little too fast. And then, as if trying to reset the board in her favor, she shifted tone, softening her voice, curling it in false humility. "I wasn't there to draft laws," Melania said, slow and deliberate, each word cushioned in elegance. "I was there to be a role model for American women." She said it with the kind of practiced conviction that turns inexperience into purpose. It was meant to reclaim moral high ground, not through action, but appearance. A performance, not a record. But Jasmine didn't buy it. Not for a second. Her body didn't move, but her presence swelled. The smile was gone. The restraint was gone. What remained was clarity, sharp, direct, unrelenting. "If American women need a role model," Jasmine began, her voice like cut stone, "they need someone with real-life experience, not someone who only knows how to pose for red carpet photos." It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a demolition of the entire premise. There was no mockery in her tone, only truth carved clean. The room felt it, tight chest, widened eyes, a ripple of unspoken awe. Jasmine leaned forward, not to attack, but to deliver. Qualification doesn't live in a photo shoot. It lives in your legislative record. Every word landed like a gavel. No theatrics. No shouting. Just the weight of substance overwhelming the shine of spectacle. And in that moment, Jasmine didn't just defend her qualifications, she redefined them. The sting of Jasmine's last words was still fresh in the air when Melania regrouped, her smile returning, tight, composed, but different now. It wasn't confidence, it was calculation. She had lost control of the narrative, and she knew it. But Melania had one card left, to play the kind that didn't need policy or facts, just centuries of social expectation and the comfort of judgment. Her eyes narrowed, not with rage, but with quiet malice, and her voice dropped into a tone of faux sympathy, deliberate, disarming, dangerous. "Where's your family, Jasmine?" she asked softly, her words slicing deeper for their calm. "Where's your husband? A woman can't represent traditional American values if she can't keep a home together." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The implication landed like a stone dropped in still water, spreading outward, quietly violent. She wasn't just questioning Jasmine's leadership. She was challenging her worth as a woman. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't groan. They just froze, caught in the shock of how low Melania was willing to go. A few heads turned. One man in the front row folded his arms, uncomfortable. A producer backstage muttered, "Cut the feed." But the cameras kept rolling, and Jasmine sat motionless. Then came the response measured lethal and impossible to misinterpret. "I don't need a man to have value." "Do you, Jasmine?" said, her tone unwavering. "Because if you didn't have one, would you even be sitting here?" The force of it wasn't volume. It was precision. It was truth. And it hit the room like a controlled explosion. You could hear hearts skip. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The host, clearly panicked, jumped in like a lifeguard seeing a drowning swimmer. "All right, let's move on to the next topic." But it was too late. Jasmine hadn't just defended herself, she'd exposed the fragility of everything Melania had built her image upon. And she wasn't done yet. The host's voice had barely faded when Jasmine shifted forward, slow and deliberate, like a general stepping into position after letting her opponent run out of ammunition. The room still hadn't recovered from her last strike. Her words about value manhood and the fragility of image were still ringing in the heads of everyone watching. But Jasmine wasn't interested in applause. She didn't come to trade barbs. She came for accountability. And now she was ready to deliver the part no one expected proof. Without a word, Jasmine tapped her tablet. The massive studio screen behind them flickered to life. For a split second, the audience assumed it might be another legislative chart. But no, this wasn't policy, it was propaganda. The image sharpened to reveal Melania Trump standing beneath a sea of white roses at the White House dressed in beige, her expression perfectly solemn. She was launching her national Be Best campaign, the initiative she claimed would fight online bullying and promote kindness among children. Her voice filled the studio, calm, clear, almost maternal. "Let's raise children who are kind, respectful, and empathetic both online and off." For a moment, the studio softened. The words were good. The optics were strong. But Jasmine didn't pause. She swiped again. Now came the contrast. The second screen lit up with a Twitter post. It wasn't Jasmine's. It wasn't even someone else's interpretation. It was a direct screenshot of Donald Trump's tweet posted within days of Melania's Be Best launch. The words were in all caps: aggressive, brutal. He referred to undocumented immigrants as animals. One word loaded with centuries of dehumanization. One word that shattered the illusion of kindness faster than any critique could. No one laughed. No one clapped. There was only stillness so heavy it could crush the air itself. Even the Fox News studio lights seemed dimmer now, like the room had swallowed its own breath. Jasmine didn't look at the screen. She didn't need to. Her eyes were locked on Melania's eyes that no longer carried heat or scorn, but something more precise: indictment. And then she spoke. Not loud, not performative, just sharp enough to cut bone. And that was the moment you chose to stay silent. Was that qualification or convenience? The question didn't explode. It sank like a stone thrown into the soul of the room. You could feel people swallowing hard. A murmur rippled across the audience, starting as a low tremor in the back row and crawling forward like something alive. Several heads turned slightly, nodding, not out of excitement but recognition. Truth has a way of doing that. It doesn't ask for permission. It arrives and settles into the chest like a weight. A woman in the third row glanced at her friend, her mouth parted just a little. A man in the front row, suited and stiff, crossed his arms tight, defensive, unsure of what expression to wear. And then there were those who refused to move at all, eyes fixed on the screen, locked in the tension between two versions of America, one that sold slogans and one that bore scars. Melania's silence said everything. Her face didn't twitch, but her hands resting neatly on her lap gripped each other just a little too tightly. She had no answer. Because there was none. Not when the receipts were that clear, not when the hypocrisy was that loud. The role model of grace and compassion had at the most critical moment chosen to say nothing, while her husband publicly stripped dignity from families with a single word. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about character, about what kind of woman America was being told to look up to, about what kind of silence we tolerate when it wears pearls and speaks softly. Jasmine hadn't just asked a question, she'd placed a mirror in the middle of the room, and no one could look away. Qualification or convenience, she had asked. And in that moment, not even Melania Trump could answer. Not truthfully, not publicly, not when the whole country was watching. The weight of Jasmine's last line qualification or convenience was still settling over the studio like smoke after a controlled burn. People weren't just quiet, they were stunned into stillness. Even the host, usually quick to redirect, sat motionless, lips slightly parted, as if unsure whether to intervene or simply bear witness. Jasmine's presence was no longer defensive, it was dominant. And the audience knew it. But what none of them knew was that Jasmine wasn't done. Not yet. The silence had created the perfect stage for what came next. Not a quote, not a story, but hard, verifiable truth. Jasmine reached once more into her folder, this time pulling out a thick, folded printout, one marked confidential, in faded gray along the top. With deliberate calm, she turned toward the camera and held the page so viewers could see what was coming. Then the studio screen behind them shifted again, revealing an email, real traceable damning. It was from a donor linked to a luxury development firm in the UAE. Jasmine didn't offer commentary. She simply let the text speak for itself. And there it was, mid-paragraph, the highlighted line that turned the temperature in the room. Sub-zero if Mrs. Trump continues promoting the image of traditional white femininity in Western media. We're prepared to offer a gift from our private collection, specifically a rare blue diamond previously held by the Al Nahyan estate. No gasp, no outrage, just air sucked out of the room all at once. Because it wasn't a vague accusation. It was proof words tied to wealth, power, and a very specific vision of womanhood bought and paid for. The kind of vision Jasmine had spent her life pushing against. The kind of deal no one ever imagined would come with jewelry instead of legislation. Jasmine stayed perfectly still, letting the screen burn that message into the eyes of everyone watching. Then she spoke, her voice low, direct and loaded with finality. Unqualified. I've never sold the truth for diamonds. The line dropped like steel. It didn't spark applause. It didn't need to. It just landed sharp and irreversible. Because in one sentence, Jasmine had done what few in politics ever managed. She made the truth feel personal, expensive, and utterly unignorable. And Melania. She didn't even flinch, because she couldn't. There was nothing left to hide behind. Not grace, not style, not even silence. The room had seen too much, and Jasmine Crockett had shown it all. The fallout from the email was still hanging in the air, like thick smoke, suffocating, undeniable. No one in the audience moved, as if the weight of what Jasmine had just revealed pinned them to their seats. The idea that elegance could be purchased, that influence could be bought with diamonds, had shattered whatever illusions of grace remained around Melania Trump. But Jasmine wasn't done. She didn't let the moment cool. Instead, she took a slow, commanding step forward. Then another. Her heels clicked against the studio floor, the sound sharp and intentional, like hammers striking glass. She moved past the moderator, past the perimeter of her seat, and came to stand directly in front of the center camera. Dead on, no filters, no distance. She didn't look at the audience or at Melania, or even at the host. She looked at America. The red light of the broadcast camera blinked, and for a split second, everything was still. Then Jasmine spoke low and deliberate, every syllable like a line drawn in cement. America doesn't need a model to write its laws, she said, her tone calm but searing. It needs someone who sat in a jail cell with the poor and knows how to use the law to get them out. The words hit like a gavel against steel. They weren't clever. They weren't poetic. They were raw, lived in, and irreversible. Jasmine wasn't making a speech. She was making a declaration of identity, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been written off for not fitting the picture-perfect mold of power. The moment fractured the room. One half of the audience shot to their feet, clapping, whistling, yelling her name through tearful eyes and clenched fists. They weren't cheering a comeback, they were cheering a reckoning. But the other half, the donors in suits, the advisors, the loyalists, they erupted too, but in anger. Boos, jeers, shouts of "sit down" and disgrace cut through the applause like crossfire. The room was no longer a studio, it was a battlefield of values. And Jasmine Crockett stood dead center, unflinching. Behind her, Melania didn't move. Her hands remained folded neatly in her lap, but the color had drained from her face. Her jaw was set, but not in power and paralysis. Her carefully curated poise now looked more like a mask frozen in place. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Because what was left to say, when truth stands up and speaks with a voice that's bled, suffered, and fought its way into the room, there is no rebuttal. There's only silence. And Melania wore it like a weight too heavy for someone who never carried anything real. The room had barely recovered from Jasmine's thunderous truth, her raw declaration that America didn't need a model in heels, but someone who had felt the cold steel of a jail cell beside the poor and still found the strength to rise. It was a blow no designer gown could soften, no diplomatic smile could outshine. Jasmine had just rewritten the rules of who gets to speak with authority in America, and the divide in the audience said it all. Half stood in thunderous applause. The other half hissed in disbelief. Melania Trump sat in the middle of it, still as glass, a mask of poise, painted over a face rapidly losing ground. But in a final desperate grasp for credibility, she spoke. Her voice came out too smooth to be natural, as though it had been rehearsed for a better moment, a different room, a script she no longer controlled. She lifted her chin, placed both hands delicately on her lap, and said with a measured calm that didn't match the quiver hiding behind it, "I believe in the right to use Philharmonic to stop dangerous legislation." It was meant to sound sophisticated. It was meant to sound involved. It was meant to sound like a woman reclaiming authority on policy. But it didn't. It sounded wrong, impossibly, undeniably wrong. For one long beat, the studio froze in confusion. Eyebrows lifted, heads tilted. The word hung there like a sour note in a symphony completely out of key. Philharmonic. The term echoed awkwardly in people's minds, colliding with their understanding of the debate. There was no Philharmonic in politics. That was music, an orchestra. And even before Jasmine opened her mouth, the realization began to ripple across the studio. Jasmine, seated just a few feet away, didn't rush. She leaned back slightly, turned her head toward Melania, and raised a single brow. It wasn't mockery. It was astonishment, half amusement, half disbelief, that this was the moment Melania had chosen to reclaim ground. Jasmine's voice came like a scalpel, precise, sharp, and impossible to mishear. "I think you meant filibuster." She paused just long enough to let the correction pierce. Then she tilted her head ever so slightly and added her tone, deceptively warm, "Philharmonic is an orchestra." The impact was immediate and seismic. The audience erupted not with debate, but with laughter. Full-bodied, uncontrollable laughter. It started in the back rows, spread forward like a tidal wave of disbelief and hilarity. Even some of the previously stiff-backed producers behind the cameras cracked smiles. The illusion had cracked. No, it had collapsed. The woman who'd just spent the last hour questioning Jasmine's qualifications had confused a legislative procedure with a symphony hall. No speechwriter could save her now. No press release could explain this away. Melania's face didn't move. She blinked once, twice, her eyes flaring ever so slightly, as if her brain was scrambling to rewind time to undo what had been said. But the damage was irreversible. She'd tried to fake her way into a policy lane she'd never walked, and she had misread the map out loud. Her hands, still folded neatly, began to tighten her knuckles, paling under the pressure of her own embarrassment. But Jasmine wasn't done, not quite. She turned to face the camera directly again, just like before. The red broadcast light was still blinking, still live, still transmitting. Her smile was cool, quiet, and surgical. With perfect timing, she delivered the final incision. "And she's the one calling me unqualified." That line didn't just land, it detonated. Not with volume, but with clarity. Because there, in front of millions of viewers, the line between performance and preparation, between appearance and authenticity, had been burned away. Jasmine Crockett had just shown that knowing how to speak in front of a camera means nothing if you don't understand the content you're speaking about. That policy isn't about posture, it's about substance. And that calling someone unqualified only works if you're not proving it about yourself in real time. The laughter continued, though now it had morphed into a deeper, more resonant reaction, one not just of humor but recognition. The American people weren't just seeing a vocabulary slip. They were seeing a collapse of credibility. They were seeing a woman once perched atop elegance and privilege, undone by her own lack of engagement with the very things she claimed to represent. The laughter wasn't cruel, it was cathartic. A national exhale. A moment where the room, the network, the audience at home all understood what had just happened without needing a single word more. Melania sat there trapped in silence, her usual armor, her control of image, her detachment, her icy restraint failing her entirely. This wasn't a hostile crowd. It was worse. It was a crowd that no longer saw her as intimidating or untouchable, but as out of her depth. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't attacked her character. She had simply waited and then let the facts of the slip in the silence do the work. It was a masterclass in restraint, in intellect, in letting truth speak louder than volume. Jasmine Crockett didn't have to prove she was qualified. In just 30 seconds, Melania Trump had proved it for her, and the entire country saw it happen. Live, unscripted, undeniable. The fallout wasn't public, not yet. But behind the studio walls, deep inside the glass offices and private Slack channels of Fox News headquarters, the panic was real. The Philharmonic clip, just 37 seconds of raw, unscripted humiliation, was already circulating like wildfire on internal servers. It didn't need flashy editing or dramatic music. The silence after Melania's blunder, the way Jasmine delivered the correction with razor-sharp calm, and the explosion of laughter that followed it was all there. Clean, crisp, unspinnable. Producers who once treated Melania's appearances like sacred theater were now whispering different words, off-brand, unprepared liability. One executive in charge of primetime messaging watched it 3 times in a row, then slammed his phone down and muttered, "We can't spin this." Not even close. Another producer messaged a colleague she'd just filibustered her own credibility out of existence. The damage wasn't just about one mistake. It was about what it revealed. The perfectly rehearsed image of Melania Trump as a poised, intelligent symbol of conservative womanhood had just fractured on live television. And worse, it wasn't Jasmine who broke it, it was Melania herself. Some tried to brush it off as a harmless slip. But in a building obsessed with messaging, no one misses the weight of a word said wrong at the wrong time on the wrong stage against the wrong opponent. Especially when that opponent turns around and looks directly into the camera and says, "And she's the one calling me unqualified." That wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a viral verdict. While producers scrambled to adjust coverage plans and advisors debated damage control, something else began to stir quietly, subtly, but with force. Across private boardrooms, encrypted chat chains, and the inboxes of national women's coalitions, Jasmine's words were landing with a very different impact. This time not as entertainment or confrontation, but as truth. Women's rights organizations, some of whom had spent years choosing diplomacy over open criticism, started to lean in. Not with headlines, not yet, but with language that signaled shift. In an internal email circulated by a senior strategist from a prominent advocacy group, one line stood out. She said what we've all been too scared to say on air. And she didn't just survive it, she owned it. Another message forwarded between the directors of several state-level women's policy initiatives read, "Forget unqualified." That was the most qualified woman on that stage. These weren't fan letters. These were testimonies from women who had spent years walking the tightrope of decorum, expectation, and televised femininity. Jasmine hadn't just spoken out. She'd cracked open the double standard with surgical clarity. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't insulted her opponent. She had held up a mirror and refused to look away. And in doing so, she had given others permission to finally say what they had whispered for years in private rooms. Elegance without courage is just silence in a prettier dress. For once, the woman who wasn't supposed to belong at the table had flipped the entire table without shouting, without posturing, and without apologizing. And those who had spent years biting their tongues, smiling through contradiction, were no longer smiling. They were listening. They were watching. And for the first time in a long time, they were nodding in public, even if just a little. The aftershocks of Jasmine's confrontation with Melania Trump had already begun reshaping the landscape in ways no one could have predicted. The clip had gone viral. The laughter had been replayed. The correction, "Philharmonic is an orchestra," was now etched into the cultural lexicon. But beneath the noise and media frenzy, something quieter, more profound was unfolding in the one place where silence usually ruled the halls of Congress. Inside a nondescript office buried in the Senate wing, a veteran Republican lawmaker sat alone. After hours, the lights dimmed, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. His office walls were lined with military memorabilia and faded campaign posters from the Reagan years. He wasn't one to waste time on viral clips, but this one had made it past every filter. It wasn't the gaffe that struck him, not really. He had seen politicians mangle words before. What gripped him was what came after. Jasmine's restraint, Jasmine's clarity, Jasmine's composure, and most of all, Jasmine's refusal to yield her ground to power, wrapped in pearls and condescension. He watched it 3 times start to finish. Then in a move that surprised even himself, he unlocked his phone, pulled up Jasmine Crockett's official congressional contact and typed, "You said what we should have said a long time ago. Thank you." He stared at the message for a few seconds. No edits, no flourish, no talking points. Just truth. Then he hit send. There was no name attached. He didn't need to sign it. Jasmine would know. The voice, the weight, the courage behind those 12 words spoke for itself. On the other end, Jasmine sat alone in her office long after the Capitol lights had dimmed. Her inbox had been flooded for days. Press inquiries, interviews, death threats, invitations, endorsements. It was chaos. But that message, that simple, quiet note from across the aisle, that was different. She read it once, then again, and she sat there for a long time, letting it settle, not as praise, but as evidence. Evidence that the truth she had spoken into that microphone had pierced beyond her base, beyond her expected audience. It had hit the people who weren't supposed to agree with her, and made them think anyway. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The message wasn't meant for headlines. It was a ripple, and ripples in Washington have a strange way of becoming tides. A week later, an envelope arrived, not via press, not through political channels, but hand-delivered by a staffer from the Committee on Civic Governance. Inside was a formal invitation to the American Principles Summit, the largest bipartisan political forum of the year. For decades, it had been dominated by think tank academics, corporate-backed moderators, and seasoned senators, mostly men, mostly white, mostly rehearsed. Never had a progressive freshman congresswoman, let alone a black woman who'd been labeled unqualified on national television, been asked to take the podium, but there it was in black ink and embossed letterhead. We invite Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to deliver a keynote address on political courage and bipartisan accountability. There was no mistake. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a diversity checkbox. It was real. A seat at the table not because someone held the door open for her, but because she kicked it open with her voice and forced the room to rearrange itself around the truth. The moment she walked into the briefing room for pre-summit coordination, heads turned. Even the staffers who'd once dismissed her as too emotional, too reactive, now stepped back to let her through. The air was different, tighter, respectful, not performative. She didn't have to raise her voice. Her presence did all the speaking. But the weight of the moment truly landed when the seating chart was released that evening. Her name sat dead center, printed in bold between 2 senior senators, 1 Democrat, 1 Republican. It wasn't just a keynote, it was a signal that something had shifted in the fabric of Washington politics. The Jasmine Crockett, once underestimated, mocked and dismissed as a side act in a media spectacle, had now recentered the conversation around truth, integrity, and the courage to call out power no matter what dress it wore. The press didn't know it yet. The headlines were still chasing the noise. But inside those private walls, among those who made decisions behind closed doors, they were already speaking her name differently. Not as a firebrand, not as a disruptor, but as something far more dangerous to the old guard, a voice that couldn't be controlled, a mirror they couldn't look away from, a presence they could no longer ignore. And all it took was one question asked into a camera with the world watching, and she's the one calling me unqualified. The answer, as it turned out, had reshaped more than just a room. It had reshaped who gets to speak in it. The summit had solidified her standing in the political world, but what came next transcended politics. It wasn't just Capitol Hill talking about Jasmine Crockett anymore. It was classrooms, barbershops, corporate offices, and living rooms. In a world where most viral moments fizzle by morning, hers had only grown sharper, more symbolic, more permanent. And then at 7:02 a.m. on a Monday morning, Time magazine dropped its latest cover. The moment it hit newsstands, inboxes, and feeds, the country stopped scrolling. The image was unflinching. Jasmine Crockett stood front and center, arms down at her sides, shoulders back, her chin lifted slightly, not in defiance but in unapologetic presence. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't performing. She wasn't polished to fit into anyone's mold. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had walked through fire and refused to be reshaped by the heat. The photo wasn't staged. It had been taken from the Fox News broadcast at the precise second she turned toward the camera and asked the question that changed everything. And she's the one calling me unqualified. Behind her, slightly blurred but unmistakable, stood Melania. Trump, motionless, hollow-eyed, caught mid-blink as the reality of the moment passed over her. The headline across the top of the magazine was devastating in its simplicity: unqualified or unapologetically qualified. No subtext, no asterisks, no softened language. Just that searing juxtaposition, one word that had been weaponized, now placed beside the truth that shattered it. The story inside the issue was unlike anything the magazine had published in years. It didn't just recount the debate, it dissected it. Every moment, every pause, every line. It opened with a brutal thesis. For too long, women in power have been measured by how well they disappear behind someone else's legacy. Jasmine Crockett refused, and in doing so, she didn't just answer a question, she created a new one for the nation. What does leadership look like when truth doesn't flinch? The piece detailed how the Fox News stage designed to trap Jasmine into defensiveness had instead become the crucible in which her entire political identity was forged in front of millions. The email scandal, the silence-to-dagger question, the Philharmonic gaffe, the final stare into the lens. It wasn't a series of viral moments, it was a single continuous arc. And Time treated it not as entertainment, but as cultural and political history in motion. But the magazine didn't stop at narrative. It went further into Jasmine's past, her record, and the contrast that made the entire event explode. A full spread broke down her 42 federal bills: community reinvestment, criminal justice reform, healthcare access, voter protection. Each was cited, footnoted past, not proposals, laws. On the opposite page, a brief timeline of Melania Trump's tenure in the White House: appearances, speeches, charity initiatives. Next to each was a note: policy participation, none. Then came the section that rattled even the most seasoned readers. A quote from a retired female senator, never before printed. "They called me too angry." They called her classy. But only one of us ever read the legislation. And it wasn't the one in heels. The article wrapped with an unapologetically pointed paragraph. Leadership isn't about knowing how to pose. It's about knowing when to stand. Jasmine Crockett stood again and again. In the hearing room, in the back rows of Congress, in the studio lights where most shrink. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't flinch. And she didn't fold when power tried to humiliate her with a single word: unqualified. And then in bold lettering beneath that, a final line. She turned that word into a mirror and made the whole country look. The cover dominated headlines for days. Morning shows debated it. Cable panels dissected it. University classes in media and gender studies built lesson plans around it. But the real shift, the one that mattered, happened in the homes of the people who had never heard Jasmine's name before that night. People who had written her off as too loud, too new, too radical. People who now saw something different, a woman who didn't just survive the machine, she rewired it live and unedited right in front of them. Across Black America, the response was even more visceral. For generations, Black women had been told to shrink their voice to be heard, to soften their brilliance to be allowed in the room. Jasmine had done the opposite. She hadn't asked. She hadn't pleaded. She hadn't smoothed her edges. She walked in sharp and stayed sharp. And now her face wasn't just on a magazine. It was on murals, on t-shirts, on classroom posters next to quotes from Angela Davis and Shirley Chisholm. In a high school in Atlanta, a student folded the Time cover and slipped it into her backpack like it was scripture. In a barbershop in Detroit, two older men argued not about her politics, but about whether their daughters could one day be that brave. In a church in Baltimore, a pastor held up the issue during a sermon and said, "This is what leadership looks like when it stops apologizing for its skin, its sex, or its voice." Even on Capitol Hill, the energy changed. Staffers who had once mocked Jasmine in hushed hallway jokes now found themselves replaying her speech behind closed doors. Aides who had worked for decades without ever seeing a black woman claim space like that found themselves walking taller, speaking louder. Something had cracked. And what leaked through wasn't anger, it was momentum. But Jasmine never gloated. When asked about the cover, she just said, "They tried to define me with one word. I gave them the whole dictionary. And in that moment, no one, not a donor, not a producer, not even a former first lady could argue otherwise. Because the image said everything. And the headline made it permanent. Unqualified or unapologetically qualified America had its answer. And her name was Jasmine Crockett. The echo of the Time magazine cover hadn't faded, it had only grown louder. Jasmine Crockett had gone from courtroom fighter to national headline to political force not by changing herself, but by standing firm when the room demanded she shrink. And yet after the interviews, the summit, the flood of attention, she didn't chase more cameras, she returned to the community that had always seen her. Not as a viral clip, not as a trending name, but as a woman who had walked where they'd walked, endured what they'd endured, and finally stood where they'd never been allowed to stand. The National Conference for Black Women had already been on the books before the Fox News debate. It was meant to be a weekend of strategy, healing, and shared vision. But now it had become something else, something bigger. Every seat in the ballroom was filled, organizers, educators, church leaders, college students, mothers, daughters, civil rights icons. Women flew in from Oakland, Atlanta, Houston, Newark. Some had watched Jasmine's rise on TV. Others had known her story for years. But all of them were here for one reason: to hear her speak. Not as a politician, but as one of their own. The room buzzed not with noise, but with expectation. Jasmine wasn't just a keynote speaker anymore. She was proof. Proof that poise didn't mean passivity, that power didn't require pedigree, that speaking truth, even when the room is built to shut you down, could break through anyway. And when her name was announced, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the applause didn't wait for her to reach the mic. It began the moment she stood. It didn't crescendo. It roared. She walked to the podium slowly, wearing a fitted navy suit, no jewelry but the congressional pin over her heart, no cue cards, no teleprompter. Her stride was calm, but her presence unmistakably electric. She scanned the crowd, met their eyes, and waited for the applause to quiet, not to command them, but to connect with them. When she spoke, her voice wasn't loud. It was anchored. "They will call you unqualified the moment you stop conforming." The room inhaled. It wasn't a soundbite. It was the beginning of something deeper. Jasmine didn't blink. "They will question your intelligence when you challenge their comfort. They will attack your tone, your hair, your name because they can't touch your truth." The audience was dead silent now, not out of restraint but reverence. These were women who had been in boardrooms and backrooms, courtrooms and kitchens, who had been told for decades to be softer, quieter, smaller. And now in Jasmine's words, they heard not just their pain, but their resistance. Jasmine took one step closer to the edge of the platform. Her tone never shifted into outrage, but it vibrated with conviction. "But remember, qualification is not something handed to you. It's something you prove choice by choice, step by step, day after day." She paused. Not for effect, for clarity. She wanted the words to sink. She wanted the youngest girl in the back and the eldest matriarch in the front row to carry that sentence out of the room and into their lives, and they did. At first it was just one woman standing, then three, then a full row, then the back half of the ballroom, then the front, then everyone. The applause hit like thunder. Not applause for a politician who spoke well, but for a truth they had all carried but had never heard said so publicly, so boldly, so unapologetically. The clapping didn't fade after 20 seconds. It built wave after wave, crashing with emotion that had lived too long in silence. Some women had tears in their eyes. Others clapped with fists. Some held hands across rows' heads, shaking in disbelief that finally someone had said it like it was. Jasmine didn't speak again. She didn't need to. Her words were still echoing in their chests. The applause reached 40 seconds, then 50, then kept going. No music played, no host interrupted. Because this wasn't just the end of a speech, it was the culmination of generations who had been told, "Not yet, not you, not like that." And here was Jasmine Crockett, uninvited but undeniable, standing on a stage that could no longer contain the truth she carried. They had called her unqualified. She had looked back and redefined the word forever. And as the applause finally quieted, something even louder remained in the air, a silence not of emptiness, but of revelation. The kind of silence that follows a thunderclap when the sky clears just enough for everyone to finally see what's been hidden behind the noise. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument on live television. She didn't just dismantle a carefully curated image of decorum in class. She shattered a narrative that had long defined who gets to speak, who gets to lead, and who gets to be believed. Her voice, sharp yet steady, had cut through decades of whispers that told women of color, stay small, stay quiet, stay grateful. This wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about Fox News. It wasn't even about Melania Trump. It was about the generations of women who were called too angry when they spoke up too loud, when they disagreed unqualified the moment they refused to conform. Jasmine knew those labels. She'd heard them her whole life, from classrooms to courtrooms to Congress. But instead of running from them, she stood in the middle of a national broadcast, looked them dead in the eye, and turned them inside out. Her words were not rehearsed for applause. They weren't polished to be palatable. They were built from survival, shaped by systems that were never designed with her in mind. And that made them all the more powerful. Jasmine had not come from legacy. She came from experience, from the lived reality of injustice, from policy fights that had human faces behind every bill, from neighborhoods where the law felt more like a blade than a shield. She didn't wear pearls to prove she belonged. She wore clarity, conviction, and scars that taught her how to fight without flinching. So when she said, "Hosegoy ban la hong ju tu kach ki ban hong fuktung, nhong hai na ho tu kach hong fai lathum, ban juok ban fatma, lathu ban chung min kwa tung luashon," it didn't sound like a political slogan. It sounded like gospel, translated to the stage of her final address. They will call you unqualified when you refuse to obey. But remember, qualification is not something you're given, it's something you prove with every choice you make. Those words were heavier than applause. They landed like truth often does, slowly at first, then all at once. Women in the audience rose to their feet, some with clenched fists, some with tear-filled eyes. And it wasn't just because Jasmine had said what needed to be said. It was because she said what so many were too tired, too afraid, or too unheard to say out loud themselves. She had turned unqualified into a mirror, one that now reflected back on the very people who had used the word as a weapon. Because what did qualified mean, really? Did it mean looking the part? Smiling through insult? Knowing how to speak without saying anything at all? Or did it mean something deeper, having the courage to carry the weight of truth, even when it makes others uncomfortable? Jasmine Crockett didn't just answer that question. She embodied it. And in doing so, she rewrote the job description of leadership right in front of a nation. The beauty of that moment wasn't that she humiliated someone. It wasn't about schadenfreude or viral victory. The beauty was in the clarity she gave to every girl, watching every woman, wondering if she had to change herself just to be taken seriously. She told them no. She showed them how. In that final scene, as she stood before a sea of black and brown women at the National Conference for Women of Color, her voice didn't tremble, it rang. Not because it was perfect, but because it was undeniably real. And the silence that followed, it wasn't awkward. It was reverent. The kind of silence that holds space for history being made. Because the truth is, Jasmine's story was never just hers. It was the story of every woman who's been called too bold, too difficult, too emotional, too loud. Every woman whose resume was longer than the man's next to her, but still got passed over. Every woman told to calm down when she demanded accountability. Every woman told she had to choose between being respected and being herself. Jasmine Crockett didn't choose. She claimed both. And that's what made this story more than a political drama. That's what made it a human lesson. A lesson in how dignity does not live in titles. A lesson in how character cannot be outsourced to a stylist. A lesson in how being underestimated is not a curse, it's a countdown to when you rise. The moral of this story isn't just about power, it's about perception and how it is often twisted to keep the right people comfortable and the wrong people quiet. But Jasmine didn't stay quiet. Not when she was insulted, not when she was provoked, not even when the nation was watching and expecting her to fold. She taught us that strength doesn't have to shout, but it never backs down. Her words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a redefinition, a new compass for what it means to lead with integrity, to fight without hate, and to speak not because it's popular, but because it's right. So when she said they will call you unqualified when you refuse to obey. But remember, qualification is not something you're given, it's something you prove with every choice you make. She wasn't just speaking to the room, she was speaking to the future, to every young woman watching from home, to every mother raising a daughter in a world that tells her to shrink, to every man who ever wondered what real strength looks like when it's quiet, principled, and unrelenting. This wasn't just a political debate, it was a turning point, not because Jasmine changed her tone, but because she refused to change her truth. And in a world that still tells so many women to be agreeable, to be soft, to be silent, she dared to be unapologetically qualified. If Jasmine's story taught us anything, it's this: watching is not enough. Clapping is not enough. Even cheering her name as a symbol will fall flat if we don't take that fire and turn it inward into something we carry, something we do. Because the truth she spoke on that stage wasn't meant to live in a quote or a social media post. It was meant to live in us. And now that we've seen what courage looks like under pressure, the only question that matters is, what will we do with it? You don't need a microphone to speak the truth. You don't need a title to protect someone who's being silenced in the room. You don't have to be in Congress to confront hypocrisy or call out bias when it shows up in the boardroom, the break room, or your own damn living room. You just need clarity and the guts to say, that's not right. Jasmine didn't dismantle an empire in one sentence. She chipped away at it with a lifetime of choices. And now it's our turn to make ours. When someone tells you to sit down because you don't fit the mold, stand up anyway. When they laugh or whisper or label you too much, be too much louder. Because silence has never saved anyone. But honesty, that's how we break chains. This is not just a story about one woman facing off against a former first lady. It's not even just about politics. It's about the line between who gets to speak and who gets spoken over, and what happens when that line is crossed, boldly, publicly, and without regret. Jasmine didn't walk into that stage to be liked. She walked in to tell the truth. And when the truth arrived, it didn't ask permission. It didn't flinch. It didn't lower its voice to make anyone comfortable. It stood tall even when the cameras tried to catch her blinking. She didn't. Not once. If you're a teacher, show your students what leadership really looks like, not just who wears the suit. If you're a father raising a daughter, remind her that her voice isn't something to be managed, it's something to be trained like a weapon of purpose. If you run a company, ask yourself, do I reward compliance or do I recognize courage? And if you're just trying to get through the day without losing yourself in a world that keeps demanding you shrink, remember Jasmine. Remember how she never blinked even when the room turned cold. She didn't ask for permission to belong. She walked in, did the work, and made the table hers. We owe it to ourselves and the next generation to do the same. Because this fight isn't about politics, it's about dignity. It's about whether we will keep allowing institutions, traditions, and titles to define what worth looks like, or whether we'll define it on our own terms. Jasmine Crockett didn't win because she shouted louder. She won because she knew who she was before they tried to define her. That's the armor. That's the blueprint. You don't have to yell to be powerful. You don't have to be perfect to be right. You just have to be unshakably real. And when that becomes more contagious than fear, the world begins to change. And here's the thing, they won't put in headlines. Jasmine wasn't extraordinary because she had a platform. She was extraordinary because she used it to tell a truth. Too many people were afraid to touch. It wasn't her volume that made the impact, it was her precision. Her refusal to play small. Her rejection of the unwritten rules that say, be nice, be quiet, be palatable. She didn't follow the script. She wrote a new one and dared us to read it out loud. So the next time someone questions your place, your value, or your voice, don't just defend it. Own it. Let them choke on the silence you refuse to fill with apologies. Let your resume be your receipts. Let your scars speak louder than their judgments. And when they say you don't belong, say it back to them. Noted, I'm still here. Because leadership doesn't wait for approval, and impact doesn't need a throne. It just needs a spine and a story like Jasmine's living inside you, pushing you to speak even when your hands shake. Your courage doesn't need polish. It needs purpose. You don't need their applause to know you're right. You need the kind of clarity that keeps you walking even when the road is cracked, even when the room is cold, even when you're the only one left standing. That's what Jasmine taught us. You don't have to be the favorite to be the fire. You don't have to be invited to change the conversation. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is show up unapologetic, unfiltered, and unwilling to play dumb just to be accepted. This is your moment now. Your family may not understand it. Your friends may fall silent when it matters. But your truth doesn't need a consensus. It needs you. Say what they won't. Do what they can't. Be what they fear. Because the next time someone asks, where are the real leaders? The answer should be a mirror. Jasmine Crockett reminded us of that. Now go remind the world. And if you ever find yourself doubting whether you're enough, whether you're qualified, whether your story matters, remember this: they will always try to measure you by standards designed to exclude you. That's the trick. The real power lies in refusing to play by their scale. Redefine what power looks like. Reclaim what qualified means. And when someone tries to hand you silence, hand them your voice instead. So don't wait. Don't wait for the stage, the microphone, or the perfect moment. Take the truth you carry, no matter how raw or jagged, and speak it anyway. That's how change begins, not in a courtroom, not in a headline, but in a decision. One moment of courage multiplied across 1,000 ordinary rooms. That's how we build a world where Jasmine's stand wasn't just iconic, it was a blueprint. Because courage once seen cannot be unseen. Now that you've seen it, you don't get to walk away unchanged. You carry it now. So use it. And if you're wondering where to start, start where it's hardest. Start in the quiet moments when no one is watching, and the easy choice is to say nothing. That's where character lives. Not in the spotlight, but in the shadows where compromise whispers and fear taps your shoulder. Start by speaking up when someone in the room is dismissed for their accent, their skin, or their silence. Start by questioning the norms that keep good people small. Because that's how systems stay alive, not with monsters, but with bystanders. And the moment you stop being one, everything shifts. You don't need to be famous to lead. You don't need a following to be worth following. You just need the will to choose truth over comfort, even when it costs you. Jasmine didn't rise because the path was open. She rose because she refused to stay where she was told. And if that kind of leadership can exist in her, it can exist in all of us. Especially now. Especially when silence has become its own kind of violence. So look around. What rooms do you sit in where someone like Jasmine would be talked over, laughed at, or left out? What policies are you passing by in your workplace, your school board, your community, because confronting them feels messy or inconvenient? This isn't about pretending to be Jasmine Crockett. It's about being the version of you that doesn't shrink when the moment demands boldness. Because the truth is, the world doesn't just need more Jasmines. It needs more people brave enough to echo her fire. And maybe we've had enough of the polished lies and empty pageantry. Maybe the new face of leadership isn't a suit or a slogan, but someone who shows up cracked open and honest. Someone who doesn't flinch when called too loud, too emotional, or too real. Maybe we're done mistaking polish for principle. Maybe we're ready for something raw, something rooted, something that doesn't flinch when the heat rises. That's what Jasmine gave us. Not perfection, but proof. Not permission, but a dare. So take this story. Carry it with you, not as a headline, not as a moment of inspiration you scroll past, but as a mirror. Ask yourself, what would it mean to live like that? To lead like that? To risk like that? To stand in a room and say the thing no one else will say, not for applause, but because it needs to be said. If you can answer that, even with trembling hands, then you're already part of the change. Because the people who change the world aren't waiting for it to be safe. They're building something new while the old world trembles. They're not trying to win every room. They're trying to wake it up. Jasmine didn't set out to destroy anyone. She just refused to disappear. And in that refusal, she lit a match. Now it's your turn to carry that fire. Start small. Start scared. But for the love of everything that's still worth fighting for, start. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.